All right, I think we're ready to get started. Thank you all, and thanks for being here. Lauren and Gary, can you hear us all right? Excellent, and I think we can hear you. So we have a large panel, as you can see, and so since I know all of you, or at least I've met most of you, I'm going to be a bit more aggressive in interrupting. It's a large and unwieldy group, so apologies in advance, but I'm probably going to just cut people off. We're going to try to keep responses to 2 minutes or less when you're talking, even if it's a big idea. But we can always circle back. And yeah, I mean, I think similar to last time, I mean, you know all these people, I think. But what I'm going to ask, and sticking to the 2-minute rule, just one sort of question to start, which is just this question of, and you can sort of take a moment to introduce yourself in here. I think it's embedded in the question of who are we? So the panel that we're having today, our last panel of the Congress, is just sort of where have we been and where should we be going? And one of the panelists said, well, who is this we that you're talking about? Because I don't know that I'm part of the we. And so what I wanted to do to start, maybe just starting down with you, Miyoko, if you want to start, but sort of just introduce yourself, and then I was going to have everyone say something that they think they may have in common with some of the other panelists, and something that you think is a point of disagreement that we might return to.
Okay, well, hi everyone. I'm Miyoko Schinner of Miyoko's Creamery. I'm also the founder of Rancho Compasión, a farmed animal sanctuary. And I would say, who are we, is a question that is now playing out in many, many more ways than ever in history. I think the traditional idea of an activist was one that, marched up and down with a picket, with a sign. And today, there's activism showing up in every single way, not just through legislation and lawmaking, but through the production of certain foods. I call myself an Epicurean activist, trying to change people's approach to food and disassociate from animal agriculture through writing books, preparing foods, et cetera. Now there's clothing, there's entrepreneurial activism. So I think activism is something that is now spreading its web into so many different ways, and there's so many more opportunities to become involved and have impact.
That's great, thank you. Epicurean activist is a very good term. Kathy, please.
I'm Catherine Meyer, the director of the Harvard Animal Law and Policy Clinic. Who are we? Well, I think I feel pretty confident in saying, I think we all care about reducing or eliminating the suffering of animals, eliminating their suffering and their distress. We all have that in common. What is different about us may be our strategies for doing that. Some people believe that it's counterproductive towards that goal to work within the current system of laws, and that the only way we're going to really achieve transformative moment is to establish rights for animals. I happen to be in both camps. I'm all for rights for animals, but in the meantime, while we're trying to get there, I think it's really important toward the goal of reducing and eliminating as much suffering and exploitation as possible to try to come up with creative ways to do that within the current system.
Go for it.
All right, is this working?
Please, yes.
Okay. I'm Leah Garces, Mercy for Animals. So who are we? I think there's sort of no end to who we are or who we could be. And when I first started as an activist, like Miyoko said, we was only those who were willing to take to the streets and do disruptive actions and take really bad salaried jobs and put everything aside for the animals. But over time, I've realized that who we are could be anyone from who's in the courtroom, who's in the boardroom, who's on the farm, who's anywhere, anyone, a consumer, any person who could care about this issue. And I hope that circle of inclusion keeps expanding. And when it's fully expanded is when I think we achieve our goals.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Dale?
So I'm Dale Jamieson. I'm professor of environmental studies and philosophy and a few other things at NYU, and also the director of the Center for Environmental and Animal Protection. And I think at our best, we are an exuberant garden of many different plants that mutually reinforce each other. And at our worst, we are interested in the individual growth of our own plant to crowd out the other plants in the garden.
Thank you, Dale. Do you have any plant in mind? Laura, go ahead, Laura, please.
Cactuses.
Cactus, yeah.
Who are we? I'm Lori Gruen, and I started out with Gary, actually, as one of the, not activists who was carrying around placards, but taking over buildings and things like that back in the day. I've since become a philosophy professor. I teach at Wesleyan University, where I also founded and coordinate Wesleyan Animal Studies. I agree that we are a diverse group. I think, though, that we're also a little bit challenged or afraid to talk more about our interest in nurturing our own plants and shading out the others. So hopefully we can get into a little bit of that discussion today.
Good. Steve, thank you.
Hello, I'm Steve Wise. I'm president of the Non-Human Rights Project, and probably what explains at least what we do is that we are a civil rights organization, and that's all we do, is we do civil rights. And I think one of the writers said that we were the animals,
ACLU.
Say it again?
ACLU. The ACLU of animals.
Right. Anyway. So that's what we care about, and we see there's been a huge amount of work on welfare, and we support it all. But what we really spend our time doing is working on civil rights. We actually follow and read about the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, what they did from the 1930s into the 1950s. We try to operate as closely to the way they operated as we can. We're just at the beginning, but we're hoping to have also the same sorts of successes as they had.
It's very interesting. Thanks, Steve. Joyce, please.
I'm Joyce Tischler, professor of practice and animal law at the Center for Animal Law Studies. And because I know it will piss off the person to my right, I'm the mother of animal law.
That's good. That doesn't irritate me at all. It's fantastic.
But who are we? We, to quote Holly Near, we are a gentle, angry people, and we are singing for their lives. We are passionate, dedicated, and we will give our lives for the animals, period.
Fantastic. Thank you, Joyce. We have two people on Zoom. Lauren, do you want to go first? Lauren?
Sure. My name is Lorna Ornelas. My pronouns are she, her. I've been involved in the animal rights movement since I was in high school in 1987. I started the first animal rights group at a high school in Texas. I've been arrested numerous times for the animals, helped pass laws for the animals, helped stop bad laws for the animals, had a case win at the California Supreme Court, and got many corporate changes on behalf of the animals. I think what we have in common is our desire to advocate for animals. And again, I think what was already said, I think we just may disagree about how we go about that. I imagine that some people might disagree with Food Empowerment Project, the organization that I started in 2007, about how we talk about farm worker justice and child labor. But for us, this framing is fundamental because we don't feel you can build a Black and brown community while ignoring the issues that impact our communities and also being consistent about food justice issues.
Thank you, Lauren. Gary, welcome.
Thanks, Justin. I think unless Justin had somebody else raise this issue with him, I'm the person who said, who are we? I take the position, I have always been a strong rights advocate, and I have always been and continue to be and will always be critical of the welfare movement. It's not that I question the sincerity of the people who do the welfare stuff. It's just I sincerely believe that that's the wrong way to go about it, and it's never going to get us anywhere. Animals are property, they're chattel, they have an economic value. It costs money to protect their interests. When we're talking about regulating use, all we're talking about is economics. We're not talking about morality. We're just talking about, are we going to take measures that make animal products more expensive or whatever? I mean, and some people find that an all right thing to pursue. I don't. I think that we are never going to make any progress as long as we're eating them, wearing them, using them. I think we need to be clear that if animals have any moral value whatsoever, veganism is a moral imperative. It's not something that, it's not a lifestyle choice. It's a moral imperative. It's what we must do. And so that's my position. My position is that welfare is never going to work. Welfare standards have always been very, very low. Historically, they've always been very low. They're very low now. All we're doing with welfare is promoting the idea that there's a right way to do the wrong thing. We're making people more comfortable about continuing to exploit animals. If animals matter, what is going on is absolutely horrendous and needs to stop, and it needs to stop now. And we need to be taking the position that this is not something that we should be doing over a period of time, and sort of, it's something that we should be insisting on now and trying to educate people about the importance of now.
Great. Well, thank you. I think we'll probably get into some of the discussion there and disagreement as we proceed. But the question I wanted to pose next, and maybe I'll start with Leah and Lori for no particular reason, but others should open it up. I was just going to ask about sort of the idea of, you have two very different backgrounds, sort of the activist and the scholar and the activist. One of the things I think folks would like to hear is just a candid reflection on what you think, something that you've done in the past that you're proud of, that you feel like is an accomplishment that the movement as a whole would rally around, and something that you might, among friends, maybe 100 friends or something, you would just admit you kind of screwed up.
All right.
Doesn't matter.
Yeah, so something that I'm proud of is in 2014, I think some of you know that I began working with a chicken factory farmer, Craig Watts in North Carolina, and to expose the realities of chicken factory farming. And through collaborating with him, before that I had literally never had a good, nice conversation with a factory farmer. But prior to that, this is the first time I went to his home. I sat in his living room and kind of understood that he too was oppressed by the system. And through collaborating with him, we ended up doing a big expose in the New York Times, which then eventually led to Purdue adopting some of the first chicken standards to improve the lives of chickens, reduce their suffering. And this opened up my mind completely to what we're now doing, which is a project called Transformation, which is working with farmers to transition them from chicken factory farming to hemp and mushrooms and other products, because those warehouses, it turns out, are very good at growing other things. So that's something I'm very proud of and continue to build on and expand organizationally, and we have visions to do it in not just the United States, but India and Brazil. Something I'm not proud of is the opposite of that, which is in the past prosecuting slaughterhouse workers and factory farmers. And specifically Mercy for Animals did that for a long time, and we would do undercover investigations, we would blame the farmer, and then we very easily gave the company this scapegoat. We handed them a present where they said, oh, it's just a bad apple, and we were not changing anything systemically. And so we don't do that anymore. We won't do that anymore. And that's a really, I think, something we did because we thought it was the right thing. There was no bad intentions there. It was, there was abject cruelty happening that needed to be addressed, but that wasn't the way to address it.
Thanks, Lou.
I'm going to start with what I think I don't know if I would say I regret it, but I have moved past it. And I think part of the idea here is that when I was quite young, blame it on him sort of, I was taken by animal suffering and the horrors of animal suffering and joined the movement so that I could do my part to end animal suffering. And animal suffering became something that really ending animal suffering drove a lot of the actions and ultimately some of the scholarship that I was also engaged in. And I think that what I'm proud of is that I've recognized that even though animal suffering matters. It's just one of many injustices that we need to address. And so what I feel really proud of is my work over the last couple of decades, trying to tie together mutually reinforcing oppressions to look at the ways in which the systems that oppress animals are systems that also harm marginalized human beings. And I think that this is a really important advance, and I'd like to see the movement embracing much more of an expansive understanding of our entanglements with one another beyond animal suffering.
Does anyone on the panel have a reaction to those comments or thoughts? Are there other panelists who heard something and said, well, yeah, Miyoko?
Yeah, I mean, just playing off of what Leah was talking about, I think when I used to talk about veganism, I've been vegan for 35 years, and people would ask me, I had a very strident sort of approach to them, and it was very turn-offish. And I think the moment of reckoning came for me when there were a couple of things. We were fighting mobile slaughterhouses where I live, and I talked to a local rancher who was also against mobile slaughterhouses. And we met in this dark alley in her pickup trucks. Nobody would see us. And she said, you know, I have to tell you, I'm really tired. This is the only thing I've ever done, but it breaks my heart every time I have to load my cattle on a transport truck and send them away. But I'm 65 years old. I don't know how to do anything else. And I realized that they're people. And this actually led to Creamery's farm transformation project as well too, that we're working with Mercy for Animals and Animal Outlook on. The other thing was, I'm on a lot of panels. I was on an industry panel at a food conference, and I don't know what happened to me, but all of a sudden I started talking about Angel, one of our cows, and I thought, oh my God, I put my foot in my big mouth, and they're never going to invite me back. And instead, when I stopped talking, the room burst into applause, and later on people came up to me, and this one woman said, oh my God, you brought tears to my eyes. I think I'm going to go vegan. And I realized that either I was silent, I had been either silent or strident. And I had to find that tone where I could show compassion for those in the room that are all pre-vegan, that need to be able to see the world in a different way, because it's all ultimately about changing perceptions. And so it really is like what you were talking about. We have to include everybody and show compassion towards the people as well as the animals, and that is where magic happens.
That's great. Thanks. Steve, yeah, please.
Let's see. I started this thinking about animals, non-human animals, I guess, 42 years ago. And we didn't have any idea as to what we could do. And for me, after I worked on it for 5 years, I really understood that the problem was that non-human animals were legal things, that they didn't have the capacity for any rights, and that they never have had any rights. And so I decided that that's what I would do. I would do the best I can to kind of change the world, if I could, as much as I can, to have non-human animals be no longer be things, but be persons. And so I remember in 1985, I said, and since it's on, I think I've seen it somewhere, I said, it's 1985, in 30 years, I'll be ready to file a case that has a chance of winning. It turned out that I was being pessimistic. It was only 28 years. And so in that time, I just felt I had to start at what could possibly work. So that's why I ended up writing like 5 books. I've taught at 9 law schools and spent a lot of time thinking and then building up the Non-Human Rights Project. And now I'm surrounded by people who are interested in working for us as we just kind of keep trying to do something. I can't tell the difference between winning and losing, because I think we have accomplished an enormous amount, but we've never won.
But you have.
We shall. Well, it depends upon how you're going to define it. Yeah. We think we've won a lot, but some of the judges, when they won't yell at me anymore, then they tell me, well, maybe things are going well. And we have had some judges now who actually say, I agree. And the last case we lost, We lost because the judge didn't want to rule against us. And she said, regrettably, I have to rule against you. So that's starting to move now.
Thank you. We have, I see both Lauren and Gary, your hands. Just, I don't know if the IT people, the screen on this side is not up, so I can actually see the people online. I don't know if you need that, but Lauren, do you want to go first?
Yes, sorry, I will figure out how to lower my hand. So, I mean, I have my own thoughts about what I'm proud of and what I regret, but because you're asking us to kind of play off of two other people's comments, I guess one of the things that, and I don't know, but, I hear this working with ranchers or people who raise and kill animals for food, and it sounds as if it's trying to get them out of that industry, which is great. I don't know how much support you're getting, but what I find really disheartening is when my organization and others advocate for people who work with vegan companies who want their rights respected and who want to be treated better. There's a lot of resistance to that. And so it's interesting that when you have vegans for advocating for themselves, and whether it be an organization or a company, there's a lot of pushback. And so I'm just hoping that this compassion that we're having to people who raise and kill animals for food isn't limited there, and it can go as well to those who are, say, our own employees who work for animal organizations, as well as, say, workers at, like, example right now is the boycott we, along with Veggie Mijas, have called against Amy's Kitchen because of the treatment of those workers. So I guess I'm just hoping that we make sure that we keep that compassion for those who work to advocate veganism as well.
Thank you, Lauren. Gary?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment. I think we need to distinguish between this idea of being compassionate and being compassionate to others and being clear about the issue. We ought always to educate people in creative, nonviolent ways. I have not only do I not have an argument with that, but I try to practice it and I urge it. But I do think we need to be clear about things. And I think that there's a tendency to mix these issues up and for people to say, well, we can't take a hard position. We can't take a clear position on this because people find it offensive and we have to be compassionate towards them. And I personally find it very odd that we're talking about the violation of the fundamental rights of animals, and that we're supposed to be compassionate toward people who are participating in that. In terms of not being, I agree, we ought not to be violent towards them. We ought to try to educate them compassionately, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be clear, and that doesn't mean that, because I see that too much, this idea that we can't take a hard position on something because it will be offensive to people. If we buy into that, then I'm not sure what we're doing. But I just wanted to make a comment on that distinction between how we educate people and whether or not we're clear about basic issues, about the moral baseline.
Thank you. And I think that actually segues to the topic that I hope a bunch of us can join in on. I was going to maybe see if Joyce and Miyoko wanted to take this first, but everybody should feel free to jump in. And that's this idea of, I mean, it's sort of two related ideas, or they're related in my head at least. And the first is the question of whether it's good or bad for the animal movement to be mainstream. So should we view the pursuit of mainstreamness, which is not a word, as a desirable end? Or is there something lost in not having a radical edge? Like, I mean, the movement looked a lot different before. Is it nice to be in a boardroom versus a picket, as Leah said? And what should we make of that? Is it the multiplicity? And then a related point is, how do we get along in this ecosystem of maybe all of those things coexist, but what does collegiality mean in this movement? And does collegiality mean that we shouldn't disagree, right? Should we not have vigorous disagreement if we think something is going wrong? I think that sometimes there's an idea that, well, one movement can learn from another movement, but if we point out the disagreements, then we have somehow violated a norm. And so where is this? Where's the role for edginess versus mainstreamness, and how do we fit together as a movement that hopefully can work together in some collegial sense? Joyce, you want to go first?
In the 80s, there was something that came out called the Movement Action Plan, and it was written by a guy named Bill Moyer, who was a social activist for many years, not to be confused with Bill Moyers from PBS. And what Bill Moyer did, and he was, he did this because he saw the early environmentalists getting really distressed and disappointed and feeling as if they had failed, when he felt as if they were really succeeding. So he wrote this movement action plan and set out, I think, 7 stages of how a movement grows and succeeds or could fail. And it's a marvelous document. It then came out in book form called Doing Democracy. And I often tell my students about this because it can look like we're failing when we're actually succeeding. What is mainstream about the animal movement now? 3 New York Times opinion pieces in the last month and a half. That's mainstream. That's it. It's subtle. It doesn't hit you on the head. And so I always look for the successes. I look for the subtle signs of success, and I see them in a lot of places. So I think we are becoming more mainstream. But again, back to Bill Moyer, as we become more mainstream, as we become more professionalized, and we are, it looks a little different than when we were all out in the street with our signs yelling and screaming. That's just how movements grow and mature.
Okay.
What was?
I said it's an evolution.
It's an evolution, yeah. As for collegiality, again, look at other movements. People don't get along. We are passionate people. We agree passionately, but more often we disagree passionately. I often compare us to Mr. Wormwood, the father, the horrible father in the film Matilda. Remember Danny DeVito played him, and there's a scene in which he's talking to Matilda, and he says to her, "I'm smart, you're stupid. I'm right, you're wrong. I'm big, you're little, and there's nothing you can do about it." And that's how let's face it, folks. Who in this room, I'm not going to put it that way. A lot of us, many of us are Mr. Wormwood. We think we are right, and anybody who disagrees with us is wrong. Despite that, we've managed to score up a lot of successes. So, unless the kind of people who come into the movement change, and I have not seen that happen in the 40-plus years I've been involved. I've seen several generations. We're all Mr. Wormwood, according to me. So, and yet, we form our little warring tribes, and within our tribe, we love everybody, and we dislike the tribes that are not agreeing with us 100%, and yet, despite each other, we make advances.
Well, I'm going to find out from you what tribe I'm in later.
Yeah, I love your answer, Joyce. I think you summed it up really, really beautifully. For me, it's really all about, activism is about the evolution of the human spirit, how we evolve from being human to being humane. And this is something, it's a journey for every single one of us. And we are all going to struggle along the way, and we're going to disagree. But ultimately, it's really about ourselves. It's really about how we end up evolving and our spirit to become better human beings, to become more compassionate, to become loving. To me, everything really just starts with, it's never changed for thousands of years. Every spiritual leader has said the same thing. It's ultimately about love. And in this movement, we have to figure out how we can show up every single day from that vantage point.
So, yeah, maybe I can, any of you can jump in, but maybe I'll sharpen it. Those are very collegial answers to my question, which is good. But let me try. It's so. There are still activists out there. There still are people with pickets.
Sure.
So 2 questions about that. First of all, is an evolution it unitary in the sense that we would expect everyone to evolve and look similar to us or act similar? And I ask that in part because Austin Surratt, I mean, Steve mentioned the Legal Defense Fund before the Animal Legal Defense Fund, that he's studying their work. I mean, Austin Surratt said of Thurgood Marshall and others' work that the activists succeeded in spite of the lawyers, not because of the lawyers. And so, when we reflect on the work of LDF, I mean, some of the great historians have said, well, it wasn't because of them. They were actually sometimes getting in the way. And so my question, if I was to sharpen it a little bit, might be, what do we make of this, right? If Joyce founded an organization, if she was still running that organization, would we put something out, a press release that says, stop doing your sit-ins, stop doing civil action, disobedience, or how should we react to this? I mean, is there a fetishizing of everybody acting the same way?
I disagree. I don't think we should act the same way. I do one thing, but I look at a problem, whatever the problem may be, and I picture it as a circle. And I think what we ought to be doing is attacking from every possible angle. So people should be demonstrating. People should be out there doing that. People should be educating, legislating, lawyering.
I mean, different things
doing
resonate
litigation.
to different people. So one approach won't work. My approach may not work for some people.
Yeah.
I mean, if I'm talking to an industry conference, I can't, if I show investigative videos, it won't resonate with them. But if I talk about the personality of a goat that saved my life, literally, that will resonate with them and bring tears to their eyes. On the other hand, if you're speaking in front of a Gen Zers in a college setting, showing those investigative videos might just be the thing that works. So we have to use different approaches depending on the audience.
Yeah,
that's great.
But I also,
yeah, please. I mean, I saw Leah. Go ahead, Lori, and then Leah.
I just want to say too that I think the question about the mainstream is a really important
jump in too, by the way.
and fundamental question, because the mainstream ultimately is the system, the structures that have led to thinking about animals and the environment as resources to be used, right? So I don't know how you could put together activists that are trying to think differently and value differently a system where there's no space, there's no real way of having animals valued. The system is designed to use these beings, to grind them up, and to support humans on them. And the environment is another way of thinking about the way we have this sort of primitive accumulation. So I just think it's really profound to think about mainstreaming the animal movement. What that means is a certain acceptance of animals and the environment as resources that we can use to our own ends. And I think it's really important to think about that in the context of mainstreaming.
Thanks. Leah? And then Steve.
Yeah, I wanted to challenge the idea that it's mutually exclusive to be mainstream and professional and edgy.
Yep.
And I think you can be both, and there are groups that need to be both. And you can borrow from the climate change movement to see that happening, where you've got, Greta Thunberg doing climate strikes and young people doing that kind of on-the-street action, while you've got, the UN meeting to create big climate change agreements. So I think you have to throw all the spaghetti at the wall, and I don't think we should assume that just because you're big and mainstream that you can't be edgy and take risks. In fact, we can take more, as we get more mainstream, I think we have bigger backups and bigger reserves and more social capital, so we can actually push harder and we can go further, and we shouldn't be afraid to do that just because now, we're more professional and large.
Yeah.
Yeah, Steve.
Great.
Steve?
Well, as I said before, you're either, in law, you're either a thing or you're a person. If you're a thing, then you don't have any possibility of being entitled to anything. And if you're a person, then you do. And those of us who spend a lot of time looking back into history knows that for centuries there were times when women didn't have rights, when children didn't have rights, when Black people didn't have rights, when Jews didn't, or Muslims didn't have rights, all kinds of people. And it's always by the mainstream. The mainstream is a biased and bigoted entity. In fact, I'm married to my wife, and what she does is spend a lot of her time trying to get people to stop being bigoted and biased. So thank you very much on that one. However, there's still 2,500 years in which non-human animals have always been that way, and by the mainstream. It's just that the mainstream's getting smaller, Now, there aren't women slaves, there aren't black slaves, there aren't children slaves. And now we've come to a point where at least all of us, in theory, we humans are all alike. Now we're just moving on to the next folks who happen not to be humans.
And slavery still does exist, by the way.
Say it again?
Slavery still does exist in parts of the world, so
Are you contradicting me?
yes,
Oh, okay.
always.
I mean, Dale, you've been quiet. I mean, can we even posit a scenario? I mean, of course, I don't think it's a binary either, and I wasn't suggesting as much. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. But I mean, if you ran an organization right now, how would you view this problem? Right? Because there is a radical element, and so part of what we're doing here, I mean, this is primarily about law. I mean, are the activists, and I mean activists that are, going in and exposing ventilation shutdown. They're illegally entering something. They're doing things on the margins that are sometimes civilly prohibited and sometimes criminally prohibited. What do you do with those people? And do they have a role in animal law, or are they the other people that we sort of ignore, but we maybe use some of their footage in a press release or something?
Well, I don't have an off-the-shelf answer to that question, but what I'm going to do is give you a couple comments in reaction to everything that I've heard, which sort of run the risk of just plunging us into some philosophical abyss, I think, rather than kind of maybe responding to things in the terms in which people have been discussing them. I mean, I think, in fact, when it comes to questions like you pose, they're highly specific and highly contextual, and you have to really figure out whether doing this thing here and now is going to make that difference or not, knowing you're quite likely to be wrong, right? But I don't think there are very many general answers in that regard. But here's the broader thing. I think pretty much, at least since the invention of agriculture, if not before that, humans have lived in a morally horrific world, basically. And the question is how to navigate the moral horrors that most people in most of human history do their best to remain blind to because life is otherwise unthinkable. And there's no utopia. I mean, we're not talking about, maybe if we did it that way, there'd be utopia. Or maybe if we did it this way, there'd be utopia. Nor is there some mega George Soros behind all of this who's got a plan to steer us towards utopia. What we've got is we've got a bunch of well-meaning people who had different mothers and fathers and grew up in different neighborhoods and different continents trying to figure out how to do the best they can in a morally horrific universe, often making terrible mistakes. And that's part of why the language of pride and regret I don't even begin to enter, because being proud of something would, for me, be a matter of regret. So I spend most of my life sort of in the spirit of Edith Piaf. I don't look at the regrets, and I don't claim that I'm proud of anything. But let me just give you two quick anecdotes to wind up on. So those of you who know China probably know that, sort of historically and culturally, China's major enemy in history has been Japan. The first opening with China was not to the United States, but it was to Japan. And the Japanese ambassador came to an audience with Chairman Mao, and he began by fulsomely apologizing for all the Japanese atrocities in World War II. And Mao said, "Oh, really, no need to apologize, because if you hadn't behaved so brutally and horrifically, we would have never been able to beat the nationalists in the Civil War and come to power." Change is unbelievably opportunistic. And you just, and you have to kind of grab these opportunities. And some of them are going to come because of terrible actions on the part of the people you most despise. Now, the last thing I want to say, going back to the garden analogy, is, animal rights organizations, universities, everything, are essentially little capitalist enterprises living in a larger capitalist ecosystem. They're going to be concerned about donors. They're going to be concerned about business plans. They're going to have to sort of survive in this broadly capitalist environment. That's going to lead to a certain kind of competition. There's going to be ideological difference. There's going to be competition for the place in the garden. All those things are just facts of life. But I think what we need to recognize is we need to see all of that against this larger view that this is a big, messy world. Perfection is not available to us. And we have to treat at least our comrades as good faith comrades trying to deal with an overwhelming amount of misery.
Thank you, Dale. Lauren, do you want to go ahead?
Oh, sorry. I have to lower my hand too. I'm not, yes, Joyce, thank you for, yes, recognizing that there is slavery as well as Black and brown and women not having all of their rights either. But I wanted just to mention that when we talk about activists who risk arrest or who do get arrested, I think to not recognize that some of us, and I definitely will not speak for everybody, but for the times that I've been arrested, many times the reason why we did it was for pushing animal law. It was for the court cases. It was making sure that everything we had with us at the time could be used to advocate animal rights at the court, at the hearings. So I just want to make sure that there are clearly some activists today who are just doing it for different reasons, but I think to recognize that a lot of times things were done, especially if we talk about the Animal Liberation Front and entities like that, that they were done to push animal law and legislation as well on behalf of animals.
Lauren, just to follow up on that, what are the activists doing today? Why are they doing it today? Or I just heard you say, I know that today it's different. I'm not sure I follow.
I think that back in the maybe late 80s, a lot of times when the Animal Liberation Front would go in and liberate animals, there was a target, there was a campaign to go along with something. So a particular researcher might be targeted, and you know the goal was to get footage out, to get documentation out, as well as the animals. But I don't know that that's exactly what's happening now. Again, we could go on the fact that there's less work being done on animals and experimentation. But I'm just saying that there usually was a campaign effort many times. I know when I got arrested, those were being done for an actual campaign. And that's a whole nother topic on strategy and if strategy is still being used for these types of actions. But I think it's important to recognize that there has been strategy used when people have risked arrest in the past.
Thank you. Thanks. So, thank you, Kathy. Go ahead. You can just speak in.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I agree with pretty much what most people have said here. And obviously, activism is extremely important to moving us forward and has been in the past. If anything, we should have more and more activism. And I know that the cases that I work on, I depend on the activism, the media, the legislative actions going on, the initiatives and referendums that are being proposed, as well as the litigation. And it's all of that together. So some of that's activism edgy, some of that's mainstream, but it's all of it together that contributes to moving us forward. When I think about, to me, a perfect example is ending the use of animals in the Ringling Brothers Circus. So we brought this case under the Endangered Species Act. We ended up, after 7 years, losing on Article 3 standing, but in the course of bringing that case, we were able to use the discovery process and cross-examination of the Ringling Brothers employees to bring out all of this evidence of how the animals were in fact being treated behind the scenes. And it was because of the evidence that we were able to generate that we could then ship out to the activists and ship out to the people who were lobbying the state legislatures and the federal legislatures and ship out to the media who were doing stories on it. All of that together resulted in people stopped buying tickets to the circus because they knew what was going on now. They didn't want to patronize it. And that in turn hurt the economic interest of Feld Entertainment, and that is what brought the end of using animals in the biggest circus in the country after 150 years. So that's how you do it. It's all of that together, and I don't think they should be at odds with each other.
I'd expand upon that because I use the Ringling example as an example of how you do, if you see Ringling as the problem, you go after it in so many ways. So it was those cases, it was the litigation, but it was also the people standing out in front of Ringling, handing out flyers. Do you know what's going on? Absolutely. It was the bullhook bans, the legislation.
Absolutely.
It all came together, and then Boom. And now they're coming back with no animals.
A no animal circus, I know.
But where are the animals? How are the elephants being treated?
As
And,
Dale
I
said,
think
we're in an imperfect world, yeah.
right. But I mean, I
Well,
think
they've
that
now
there's
been
a sense in
sent,
which
they've been sent to a sanctuary. They're being treated well now.
It's not a very
no,
good sanctuary.
it's not a
that they're in.
sanctuary.
Yeah.
No, White Oak. White Oak? Is that
Yeah,
what you're talking
it's
about?
not a good.
The one in Florida.
Right.
Yeah, White
Yeah,
Oak. Well,
it's
it's better than the lives they had. And let me
That
just
is-
say, it's not just the animals that were in the circus at the time it ended. It's all the future generations of animals that have been saved. Those animals that weren't born yet. They're not going to be in a circus. They're not going to be beaten by bullhooks. They're not going to be kept on concrete every day. They're not going to be chained their entire lives. They're not. Those animals have been saved. The ones that weren't born. The progeny of the animals that had to be used, for the case in hand. They're saved. So,
Gary, you're being very polite to not jump in. You can jump in when you want, but your hand is up also. We can't hear you though. You're muted.
I wanted to ask Lauren, when you said a couple of minutes ago that animals aren't being, or fewer animals are, about experimentation, about vivisection, what was the comment you made? I may have misunderstood it.
Oh, just that, how do I try to be so delicate in saying some of this stuff? I feel like
He's being very delicate.
if everybody who knows me there knows I am doing my best here. I would say that the movement has let certain animals down. And I feel like a lot of emphasis, which is rightly so, right? Like we've put a lot more emphasis on non-human animals who are killed for food, and rightly so. But I just wish that there were still some organizations out there who focused on animals and experimentation and other animals. So that's kind of what I meant by that.
Okay, I appreciate that because, let me say, I thought what you were saying is that there were fewer animals being used in experiments. And actually, there are more animals now being used than there were 30 years ago when we were doing this stuff.
Yep.
And interestingly, what has changed, and it's a good, I think, a good example of where the movement goes wrong. I remember the controversy in the mid-1980s as to whether or not the movement was going to get behind the amendments, the 1985 amendments to the Animal Welfare Act. And the movement was, or at least the people that were dealing with it at the time, thought this was a really great idea because it was going to create animal care committees. And that would regulate the use of animals better, and because we would have something that would be similar to an institutional review board, which is used for human experimentation, which of course it was never going to be. But there was this mechanism set up, and what happened was when the movement got behind it, the movement. I remember a meeting I will never forget, actually, a meeting that we had in D.C. And I was the only person in this meeting who said, I don't think we should support these amendments. I think these amendments are a really bad idea. And interestingly, the movement got behind it, supported the amendments, and now we don't know anything about what's really going on in experiments anymore, because before the 1985 amendments, we would have people who were talking to us all the time about what was going on in laboratories. The 1985 amendments contained a provision which said that if you released proprietary information, you could incur criminal liability. And so, and the people who were on the animal care committees weren't going to talk to anybody because they were concerned about being criminally liable. So actually, the 1985 amendments not only did nothing to make things better for laboratory animals, despite it being celebrated as a success of the movement, that it did nothing to stop the use of animals. It did nothing to not that I'm in favor of regulation, but it didn't even do that very well. But it also shut down the information stream. So that was an example of where, and I think that this happens an awful lot. I mean, I don't share the enthusiasm that some of my colleagues here do for some of this welfare stuff, because I think it's basically blunting the horror of this all, the moral catastrophe that's going on, ends up being made to look better, that we're doing, that things are being done in a better way. And I think what's sort of troubling to me is how, as a movement, how dissimilar we are, I mean, to other rights movements. I mean, would anybody have, I mean, I would find it insane if someone were to propose something like let's have, misogyny-free Monday or racism-free Monday. But yet we talk about meat-free Monday as though this is a good thing. It's not even a vegan Monday, it's a meat-free Monday. It's like, go ahead, eat those eggs. This is what's troubling to me, is that if you look at our movement, it bears very little relationship to other rights movements, in that the positions we take we would never take those positions if humans were involved. And that's something that I think
we'll circle back on this point too more, Gary. Thank you. I think that is an important point, and I want to maybe throw out there this question of what are we as a political movement? And Lori, I was going to pose this question to you of, it seems like everyone agrees online and on the stage that we should be doing everything. It's a rare moment of complete agreement, I guess. So everyone agrees we should be doing all these different things. But in terms of building a movement that's attacking from all sides, one of the strategies, I guess one of the ways that Joyce would say, like attacking the circle from different ways, is to center the human in the advocacy. And I don't mean here in the way that Lauren was referring to earlier, though we'll come back to that in terms of looking at oppressions of humans, whether they're carceral or labor. I mean here in terms of there is a human that will suffer if we don't do this. Downed cows are a health risk. The link, right? If we don't punish, we're going to have people committing domestic violence down the road. Environmental advocates, at least that's one of the things I learned from the book, from Randy's book. We have to take this idea of environmental harm is going to be bad for humans, so animal harm will be bad for humans. What do you think about this strategy as one of the many, right? Because I guess we all agree that we should have many.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important. I mean, I guess I want to sort of follow up on something Gary said and then return to that. I mean, I actually think that we do have a long history of looking at social change movements and seeing that there are fundamental differences between reform projects and revolutionary projects of a certain sort. And I think we see that in, the civil rights movement. I think we see that in the women's movement. We see that in gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and questioning movement. I mean, there are some people who want to reform the system and other people who want to overthrow the system. And I think importantly, something I've been working on, there's a third way of thinking about this, which is a non-reformist reform way of doing it, so that we're making change, but we're making change in a way that's not reinforcing the system of exploitation and expropriation. So that's, I think, a really fundamental thing to notice and really important for the movement to start thinking about. So it's not going to be the case that everything is going to work fine, because reform is going to work against significant structural change. That's just true, and so we need to acknowledge that there's going to be these differences, these fundamental differences. And one way of thinking about that is to think about whether or not the traditional ways of, sorry to get philosophical, but this traditional ways of ethical thinking, where we have humans at the center and we're expanding our circle outward, is actually the right way to think about what it is that we should be doing in the movement, or whether what we should be trying to do is trying to undo the human supremacist hierarchies. And maybe there will be different moments of doing different things, but it's really important, I think, at this stage, after 50 years of trying to minimize animal suffering, when there's just more animal suffering than ever before, that we really start thinking about, are some of the strategies we're doing and using and relying on, some of those spokes, are those reinforcing the problems that are at the heart? And I think it's really the time to be thinking about that. It's not easy. I'm not saying it's nice that we're going to be able to be like, oh, kumbaya. No, as Dale was saying, we live in a horror pit. We're going to end up disagreeing about things.
Dale, I know you want to go. Kathy seems eager. I'm going to let Kathy go, and then maybe you. Is that okay? Yeah, go ahead, Kathy.
I mean, my view on this is whatever works, go for it. I mean, do the animals really care if it's a welfare issue or a rights issue, if you're saving their lives? I don't think the animals care. I'll give you a perfect example. My clinic right now is working on a case. We have challenged the USDA's refusal to establish humane standards for the handling of poultry at the slaughterhouse. Now, the Poultry Products Inspection Act says nothing about animals. It's not focused on animal welfare at all. It's only focused on human health. And the whole purpose of the statute is to make sure that the product at the end of the line is not adulterated. There's nothing in that statute that it has anything to do with animal welfare. However, in recent years, the USDA has acknowledged that live birds at the poultry plant that are treated inhumanely, and they suffer from lacerations and bruises, and they're left in cold temperatures, et cetera, and there are a lot of horrible things that go on while they're waiting to be slaughtered, those inhumane practices result in an adulterated product at the end of the line. So once that link was made, my clients decided to petition the agency to now, because of that link, now the agency has jurisdiction over this matter. And it has jurisdiction to establish, for the first time, humane standards banning these inhumane practices at the slaughterhouse. And we filed a lawsuit, and we won the motion to dismiss on standing, and we're now on the merits of that case. If we win that case, and as a result, we have better standards for the birds, the live birds at the slaughterhouse, do they really care if it was we didn't establish that they had rights in order to help save them? I don't think the birds will care. Yes, I agree, all of that, the slaughterhouse should be completely done away with, and all of these practices should be done away with, but in the meantime, again, my position is go for whatever strategy works to help reduce or end the suffering of animals.
Thanks, Kelly. And we will come out. Dale, and then.
Well, so I sort of have a comment on the analogy to other movements, and I have a comment on centering the human. And so, which one? You try to go for both in 2 minutes? Okay. So, well, the first thing is this, just on these analogies, which I think are like really, really, really complicated when you really bear down on them. But I'm just going to give you an anecdote which I found very moving many years ago. So Jimmy Carter was really the first US president to adopt, in recent years, decades, to adopt an international human rights policy. And of course, a lot of the discussion we're having here was in play. This is hypocritical, human rights still get traded off, all this kind of stuff. You should be more rigorous about this. And I remember reading an essay by Ariel Dorfman, who had been in Pinochet's prisons, and as a result got sprung and exiled to the United States as a result of Jimmy Carter's human rights policies. And he was just stunned to be thrown into this theoretical vortex in which he found himself having had his own life and dignity saved. So that's just one policy and one situation. They're all quite different, but that's one that was very moving to me. In terms of the centering of the human, very quickly, again, the degree of human-centeredness in campaigns, I think, depends a lot, on the particular campaign. But in a way, the logical structure of what we're trying to do is we're trying to get one kind of animal, namely Homo sapiens, to stop treating other kinds of animals horribly. And if we're going to do that, we're going to have to work with the kinds of brains and the kinds of psychologies and the kinds of dispositions that the dominant species has. And we know a lot about those. We know they heavily discount the future. We know they privilege the near and dear. We know about the kinds of logical fallacies that animals like us, even those of us on the stage, systematically engage in. And so if there's going to be change, it's going to have to be mediated through the psychological capacities of this species. And that means that, to some extent, those animals, us, are going to have, they're ineliminably in the game in some way. You can't simply draw attention to moral reality or how people ought to be, although those appeals can be powerful and important in some contexts. But you just cannot get away from running this through Homo sapiens.
I think you're so right. And I also want to just say I have high hopes for humanity because our psychology, our psyche, our spirits are evolving, and they have over the centuries. We still have slavery, but we have less slavery than one time. We still have sexism, but it's less than it was during the women's lib movement in the 60s and in centuries before. We have made progress as a species, and we're going to continue making progress, which is why I believe that all of these measures that we're taking are making an impact, but ultimately it is about how we show up, how we change. We are the ones that have to evolve. Our hearts and minds have to evolve, and we do have to really look at whether or not we are the dominant species. I mean, and I think that we're going in that direction. I have huge hope for the future.
If I can say, if you're trying to, we may not be exactly in agreement.
I'm shocked.
No, not you.
Oh,
Down.
oh, I see, sorry.
Maybe you too. I don't know.
I'm still shocked.
We haven't started talking privately. Who knows?
I shock easily.
But when you actually have cases and you can not go for rights, but you can somehow win on for some other reason without rights. I agree. You may have helped them. Thank goodness. But when we look at that, we're not interested in doing something that just saves a small number of people. What we're trying to do is file a lawsuit that will lead to some kind of a legal rule that will, for example, in our Happy the Elephant case, we're trying to get one elephant out of the Bronx Zoo and into, say, the Tennessee Elephant Sanctuary. That would be good. We'd be very happy. But we'd be a lot more happy if there was some kind of a legal rule that says that an elephant should be a person and should have certain rights. And the whole species is now under that rule. That's what we think is the more important.
Absolutely.
But I just want to say, I really think we're going to get there. I mean, if you just think back 30 years ago, people tied their dogs up in the backyard and they thought it was totally fine. We all did, or many people did. And people are horrified by that notion. We are going to get to a point where our perceptions, that dissonance is going to go away. So I'm maybe very naively optimistic, but
It may take a while.
it may take a while, but I do believe that humanity is evolving in that direction.
We're in a very
I agree with both of you on that, it's going to happen, but it ain't going to take a short period of time.
Yeah. We're in a very interesting time in our history as human beings, right? I think we all agree. And it could go either way. You know, we may continue going in the direction of annihilating ourselves and annihilating humanity. And if that happens, it will be ugly and painful, but it might not be all
It'll be fine for the
sad.
animals.
You know, because we've not done great things with the planet, let's face it. But on the other end,
Are you okay?
well, come on. I mean,
Scaring me.
Oh, sorry. I mean, really, we've become parasites to our own planet. But at the same time, this is an opportunity for enormous growth as human beings. I mean, we might actually become less violent as human beings.
Yes.
We really think about this. We might actually stop eating other animals and stop experimenting on them. Long term, obviously. I mean, that's the dream that I hold, is that someday meat will be what comes out of a laboratory, essentially. It will come from a cow who got, some cow got biopsied, but cell-cultivated meat will be a reality. That's what I hope for. And a lot of times it's technology that saves us. It's human-made technology. And one example that I give is, I agree with Gary to an extent. I mean, that's the best I can do, Gary. And that is that the Animal Welfare Act has been a failure. And we spent 15 years trying to litigate to get the USDA to enforce that law, and we failed. We failed to do that. But then in 2007, a group of toxicologists got together, and there was one animal protectionist, Marty Stevens was there. And these toxicologists came together because there was a problem. And the problem was that toxicology testing was going too slowly, was too expensive, and a lot of chemicals were coming out without having been tested. And they realized the reason it is a broken system is that we're doing this to animals. And we need to develop technology to replace the animals. And since then, I've sat in rooms with toxicologists, who would have thought? And we actually agree, yes, we need to move on. We need to move to cell cultures, computer models, assays, all the things that are now being developed to replace animals in toxicology, which in my mind, I hope will replace animals more generally in research. Because ultimately it's replacement that we're going for, whether it's veganism or research or whatever else. We want to get animals out of there altogether, and the question is how. And each of us is trying. I mean, I think if we could acknowledge that even though we disagree about the method, each of us really wants the best for the animals.
Yeah.
And the reality is we don't know if we're right or wrong. Somebody 50 years or 100 years from now will look back and say, oh, you were right and you were wrong. So it goes. We're doing the best we can.
That's a good. I had Gary and then Lauren. I want to get to both of you. I think, Gary, your hand was up first. But Gary, I do want to, the conversation has been helpful for me, at least, learning some things. But I wanted, to add to this, I know you wanted to speak to this question, the human-centered question, but to maybe just slightly add to it. And I know this is a question that you reject entirely, so that's all right. But what do you think is, speaking of human-centered, what do you think, Gary, is the most important animal law case in the last 10 years?
He's frozen.
I recently taught animal law again. I haven't taught it in a number of years. Since we closed the clinic, actually, I teach mostly animal ethics course. And I taught animal law this past semester. And I was astounded by how little had happened. And if it turns you on, it turns you on, that's fine. But I don't think animal law, I think animal law is, Steve Wise is doing some interesting stuff. I don't know if it's ever going to work, but I think Steve is at least focused on the larger question of personhood, and he's trying to get that to be part of the legal system. As I say, I don't know whether it can work because I think there's too much of a resistance that. If elephants become persons, then we have to worry about the ones we eat, and that's the main issue. We eat them, and so I guess I couldn't say that I found a favorite case. There are many competing for the cases that I think do very little. Very, very little in terms of moving the needle. And so, but I did the point I wanted to make is going back to Kathy's point. She said, well, the question is it working? And we have to do what works. And I think there's a real issue about what does work, and is something, is a case that, that gets some sort of regulations in terms of chicken slaughtering. Is that really going to do anything? Is that really going to do anything at all? Or is it actually going to make matters worse because it's going to get people to think wrongly, in my view, that things are being done better now, so they feel less problematic about continuing to consume animals. That is something I don't think our movement thinks about much at all in terms of the welfare consequences. That's a serious issue. And this idea that, well, as long as it stops some suffering, it's something we ought to pursue. I don't think that that's necessarily true because I don't think it does stop suffering. And also we have to take a step back and say it's a zero-sum game. Every time we do something like that, we're taking resources away from making different sorts of changes that may be more meaningful. And I think, we don't talk about that. We started talking about that in the 1990s and it got shut down pretty quickly. And so, but I do think that those are issues we need to discuss.
What would you do, Gary? I hear about what you wouldn't do, but what would you do?
I honestly believe nothing's going to change as long as most people are eating them. And that's the reality. We can have all the discussions we want about changes that we want to make, but as long as people are eating them, and as long as their primary relationship to animals is shoving them in their mouths 3 times a day, and putting them on their backs and their feet, nothing's ever going to change. And so I think our movement, there is
No animal organization in this country takes the position that veganism is a moral imperative. They take the position that veganism is a good thing to do. It may be the gold standard, but everybody, all of these groups promote animal welfare reform. And I think they send out a terribly confused message. And I think that if we had a movement that promoted veganism, and we took all of the resources and all of the energy and all of the passion and put it into unequivocal, clear vegan advocacy, I think we would be further ahead than we are now, because I don't think anything's
Thanks,
gonna
Gary.
change.
And I know that Joyce asked you a follow-up question.
Sorry about
But I do want to keep it. Lauren, you had your hand up for a while.
I guess I just wanted to say that sometimes I wonder how much human-centeredness some of this stuff really is. I think at the end of the day, many groups' end goal is the animals. And sometimes I worry that a disservice is being done in two ways. One is that many times, say, Black and brown community members who are living near, say, a dairy farm are kind of used as props to further the goal. And two is that I worry that those the fence line communities who are living there are also done a disservice because they are, I don't really know, but in my experience in this stuff is that there isn't a true discussion with people who live in the communities about animal sentience. And so I feel like if people are going to be doing this human-centeredness, they need to respect the people who they're working with and explain the animal perspective it as well, as not just walk away when whatever they achieved was met. So they file a lawsuit against the dairy industry, but that community still doesn't have drinkable water, that they don't just get up and walk away. So consistency on both ends, one for the human and one for the non-human animals. I think there needs to be both.
Excellent.
Justin.
Kathy, do you want please, Leah.
Yeah. I've never been on a.
You should just jump in.
Okay,
Leah.
I'm trying.
sorry.
It's
No,
just-
no.
I'm actually just feel like I'm watching like a Jerry Springer kind of show.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Super entertaining, and I'm getting like absorbed in the
Are you
in
accusing
the
me
debate.
of being
Yeah,
Jerry Springer?
you're Jerry Springer. Yeah. So I'm getting so absorbed in it.
I mean, there's going to be a paternity test?
Well, he did take off his sling, and he told me because he took off his sling because he was going to stop us from punching each other. So, but I will say two things. One, I want to respond to the people human-centric. I also want to say it's very fun to debate this reform or the rights welfare approach, but there's a trap here that I really prefer never to go into, which is the tyranny of the small differences. Mm-hmm. I mean, we're really the few fighting for animals in the world, and we have small approaches that are slightly different, but we're all pushing this boulder up a hill. And I respect everyone in this room, and I respect all the different approaches. So I'm not going we are a welfare organization who works for reform. We also are working towards the end of animal exploitation altogether. We do both. I believe both are effective. And I believe the way we're working is effective. But I also believe that all the spaghetti needs to be thrown at the wall to push the giant boulder up the hill. All of it. Big, messy spaghetti fight. But just to respond to the human-centric side of things, so we just some of us came back from Nairobi this week from working on a UN resolution for the first time on animal welfare. And it was built on this concept of One Health that the UN has now adopted. And it's One Health, One Welfare. And it's recognizing the interconnectedness of the way animal suffering, which has never been recognized at the United Nations before, and human suffering and the future of humans and the future of the planet. So the concept is that the systems that suppress animal welfare or the systems that cause animal suffering are the very same systems that are driving harm to nature. And so and it was at the UN Environment Program, if we are going to achieve the priorities of UNEA, which is looking at biodiversity loss, climate change, and pollution, that we can't ignore animal suffering. And this is really a big deal. This was a historic resolution recognizing animal suffering for the very first time in the history of the UN. But it built on this concept of our interconnectedness and the importance of the interconnectedness and kind of not, othering anything, that we're all connected. And somebody said in the previous panel, which I hadn't heard before, but people are starting to talk about nature rights, but it was like one health, one welfare, one rights. And I think that's an interesting kind of line to keep following when you have 197 nations of the world. And it was agreed by consensus. That's a big deal. That's a big moment for our movement as an animal protection movement as a whole. No matter where you fall on that giant spectrum, that's a big deal.
I want to just jump in and respond to something Lauren said. And if I understood you correctly, Lauren, first of all, I totally agree with you, if I heard this correctly, that we do need to talk to people in the animal agricultural community, the workers, et cetera, about animal sentience. I think you said, is anyone talking to them, if I heard that correctly? And I do live in ag land. I'm surrounded by ranches. And I'm a member of our local ladies auxiliary, where there's lots of women, ranchers and dairy farmers, as well as just other homesteaders, backyard chicken people, et cetera. And I talk to them about my animals all the time. In fact, they've asked me to do a couple of vegan cooking classes. And I have a tattoo that says phenomenally vegan. I even had these fake tattoos. And I got everyone, including ranchers, to put these tattoos on. And we took a photo. And, I think what we have to do is, for me, it's all about, as I said, evolving the human spirit and trying to create for us to become humane. And so we have to inspire people to become better selves of who they can be. All of these people say they love animals, whether it's for animal welfare or they just want to get rid of it whatsoever. We do have vegans in the community as well. But whatever it is, we have to show them that they too can play take a role in bettering the system or transitioning to a compassionate world. And you have to inspire them. So I always talk to everyone about the sentience of animals. I don't care if they're farming. I've hugged farmers. I've invited them to my dinner table and had long discussions about what it means. I had the CEO of a very large dairy who talked to me. We went out for coffee and I asked him, we talked about, because I had posted something about calf hutches and I had insulted him. And so we went out for coffee and I said, I'm really sorry, but it just breaks my heart when the babies are taken away. Why is that? And he said, well, it's better for the babies. They don't get sick that way because the mom's teats could be in dirt and blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, then how come on the cow-calf operations, the babies are never separated? And he said, I never thought about that. And so, oftentimes.
Now he's going to start separating.
No. He's not a.
teasing.
We're going to finish this thought.
Okay. The point is, they're born into a certain lifestyle. They're taught a certain myth, and you have to show them a different way of thinking. And believe it or not, they are open to it. Right now, we have a new program that my sanctuary started with 2 other sanctuaries called LEAP, Leaders for Ethics, Animals, and Planet. And it's a program that aims to supplant FFA and 4-H. And we're targeting kids in our communities that are interested in agriculture, animal agriculture, but showing them you don't have to kill your animal at the end. You can fall in love with them, you can raise them, you can do a different form of agriculture that doesn't involve animals and volunteer to sanctuary, and we give you a scholarship at the end. So I think we do have to talk to these communities. We do have to talk about sentience. We do have to make them the heroes to participate in a new economy.
If I may say,
Go ahead.
there's a difference in all of the people you see. You see, when you're like me and you're a lawyer, you have to persuade either 4 or 5 judges that you're right. So all you care about is what those judges are going to do to you. Are they going to go yes or are they going to be no? So there is a case in the last 5 years. It was 3 weeks ago. Ecuador said that all non-human animals have rights as of 3 weeks ago in Ecuador. And they weren't kidding around either. And they also said that they'll take our habeas corpus cases. Unfortunately, it's not yet in New York, it's in Ecuador. But what that's going to mean is, and by the way, we worked along with the Harvard people, filed a really good amicus curiae brief to get that case go that way. But indeed, at least in theory, as it says, as of 3 weeks ago, all non-human animals in Ecuador have rights that come from the state of nature, period.
Thank you. Joyce, do you want to say something quickly?
Here's my viewpoint about how change occurs, and you can agree or disagree, it's okay. Henry Spira used to say that his job was to push the peanut, right? And the visual that I get is that I'm in a football stadium and I'm on my hands and my knees, or my hands are behind me, and I'm pushing the peanut with my nose. God damn it, get down there and push the peanut. Because I can't see another way to do it. Veganism, yeah, absolutely. But people are eating more meat today than ever before. China's raising 10 times as many animals as we do in the US. Why? Because the human animal, as soon as they get some money, they want to show they have money. And I've met with and read about Chinese people who say, I'm eating meat 3 times a day, and they're very proud of that. So we need to find a way to replace that, to make the cell cultivated, make the plant-based. I mean, we need to create vegans, and in some ways we're doing okay. I mean, now they don't laugh at us as much anymore, right? It used to be, oh, vegan, right? You eat cardboard, don't you? And we're getting.
Now they fight us.
Yeah, now
They want that Miyoko's cheese.
It is
That's the second stage. We've made progress.
I mean, if any of you had been subjected to being in one of my classes, you'd know that I don't care about keeping people over. But I don't want to keep you here extra time in this beautiful day. And so we had a couple of final questions. And just because I hadn't heard from some people up here as much as others, I thought I might pose a question that maybe to Lauren, and Lori, you could respond, and then maybe we'll close with one other quick question so we have time for questions from the audience. So Lauren, I mean, one of the things that we haven't had time to discuss very much, but you raised it in your introduction, and I think it is really important, and it's important to a lot of people here, is the idea of how these oppressions overlap, I think is the term you used, and or maybe that was Lori, but we're familiar with your advocacy in that realm. And I guess one of the things that was striking to me to hear today, some of this I've known, and it's new framings, was Leah saying just really candidly, and I thought powerfully, that one of her regrets was the engagement of Mercy for Animals in prosecutions of individuals, even at a corporate farm, right? So not just the person who kicks a dog, but somebody that's in a corporate farm. I think that's a powerful testament of change from one of the leaders in our movement. And I wonder if you think, Lauren, that is part of the overlapping oppression that we should be thinking about as a movement. And then, Lori, I'll let you respond, and we have a final question.
I definitely think it is. I think that one of the things I get worried about when we talk about it is that it's who the organization, or I should say, what is the organization that's doing this? Because I think that when vegan organizations strike out to advocate against about how slaughterhouse workers are treated, there's a disconnect there. So my organization, being a vegan organization, doesn't really, although we definitely think slaughterhouse workers deserve rights, it's not something we advocate for because we don't think slaughterhouses are good for anybody. So at the end of the day, it doesn't make sense for an organization like ours to go out and advocate for slaughterhouse workers. How you posed it, like initially how we're going to talk about this is, what is the organization's mission? And so some organizations' missions may be a welfare organization, which I know we already talked about a little bit, but maybe it's more consistent for them to talk about slaughterhouse workers, because in essence, if you're working on welfare, you're saying it's okay for animals to be raised and slaughtered for food. But if you're a vegan and animal rights organization, it doesn't make sense to be working about slaughterhouse workers, because the slaughterhouse workers can get certain rights met, but they're still going to be killing animals. And if your goal is to stop people from killing and consuming animals, it doesn't make sense to be advocating in that regard. Now, do I think that animal rights organizations need to change what it is that they do and start advocating for human rights? it's about your mission. What is the mission of your organization? My organization's mission is to advocate for both human and non-human and human animal rights. So it's consistent for us. But if your organization's mission is to advocate for non-human animals, then we need you to be doing that. What we would ask is you be a little bit more consistent in how you talk about things that impact human animals as well, and how it is that you, well, just talk about these issues in general, and advocating for human beings, and maybe just be more consistent in your own ethics as an organization.
Thank you. Lori, do you want to respond
So-
in a minute?
So I just wanted to say and some of us have already said this, but we're really complicated, contradictory animals. As humans, we're a mess. And I don't think, I love the idea of being more consistent. It's something I want my students to do. It's something I've been, I don't know, I would like it for us to be more consistent, but I know that we're really complicated, contradictory, messy creatures. I do think, though, that maybe what we could do is be more clear about what it is that we value and be more articulate about what we value. And if we are able to do that, we might be better able to see if we're being consistent or if we're being contradictory. And we could see that, oh, well, if I do this, and it's going to treat, a community of color in a way that is familiar to them, for example, incarcerating people in various ways who are already targeted populations. Let's just say that's what we're doing. And then we have something we can argue about and talk about together instead of pretending we're doing it for the animals and there's nothing else and that messy humans aren't animals. So I think that there's a really important way in which one of the things, we are very complicated and have lots of different motivations. There is no one right answer. We should really try to have more humility and be more clear about what we are valuing. I mean, I think one of the things that Steve and Gary have been doing is being very, very clear about what their values are. You might disagree completely with what they're doing, but they don't waver. They're very consistent. I might not agree, but they're very, very consistent. And so I think that is an important sense. Think about what it is that you value, say it out loud, and let people argue about those values. I mean, that's a way to make progress, and I think that would be a really helpful way to go.
Terrific, thanks. I think we should turn to questions, because there's a lot of things, and there's a number of other questions I had sent around to you all, but we should hear from everyone in the audience if you want to ask questions. If not, we'll proceed. But does anybody want to go to the microphone in the back? Timothy?
Go?
Please.
Okay. Hi, Timothy Pachirat. So U.S. society as a whole, I think it's fair to say, has been rocked by recent movements in society around race. I'm thinking specifically of Black Lives Matter, and around gender and sexual harassment. I'm thinking of Me Too. And I'd like to ask the panelists on the stage to comment on whether and how those two movements have shaped how you understand advocating for animals. And returning in particular to Lori Gruen's opening comment about the suggestion that to advocate for animals with an absence of understanding of how oppressions are interconnected is actually to work backwards. So there's a lot more I could say, but I'm interested in what you have to say as the people who have been chosen to be on the stage.
How about 30 seconds each? We can go down. Joyce, do you want to start?
I think it's wonderful for us to always, at every opportunity, work with people who are in other movements. And I'll give an example. I've been pushing for 30 years to work more closely with the environmental movement. But here's the limit. Environmentalists will push for the use of the leg hold trap. I will never agree to the use of the leg hold trap. Some environmentalists push for more testing on animals. I will never agree to that. Some environmentalists push that with CAFOs, we should move towards sustainable or regenerative agriculture. That's not where I want to head. I will teach students about it, but I don't want to go there. That doesn't mean I won't work with environmentalists. It means that I understand and I'm really clear that the animals always come first for me, and I will never settle or put the animals second, because if I do that, I'm a traitor. I'm a traitor to the animals.
Steve?
I'll be even shorter, but not surprising. I'm in favor of rights. And if anything you do, if what you're doing can help rights, then we're behind you, and we will do whatever we can to help you all over the world. And if they have to do, even when they have to do with treating non-human animals well, we say we're in favor of that, but we only have a certain amount of resources, and we're going to stay on one thing, which is to gain rights and move from things to persons.
I already said this. Thanks for the question, Timothy. I mean, I think fundamentally we're in a variety of relationships near and far with others, both human and non-human, and we should do everything that we possibly can to make those relationships as good as they can be and to act with integrity in our interactions with others, whether they're non-human others or human others, and I think that should be a fundamental goal for liberation.
So my platitude is that in addition to all of that, it's also part of the environment, that we live in the sea of injustice, and waves form and break at different times, and certain kinds of injustices come to public notice and then subside, and other forms of injustice also come to public notice. And everything else aside, it should affect the kinds of appeals you make, the kinds of rhetoric you have, and how you position yourself. So in addition to all of these injustices are, of course, linked, there is also just the kind of question of the environment in which you make certain kinds of appeals. So.
30 seconds, that's hard for that big, I don't know where you went, but you're hiding now. I can't even see with the lights. So we made a lot of changes. Black Lives Matter, Me Too. We expanded our board from 3 people to 10. 3 of which are people of color, and we wrote a 9-point plan on how we were going to work on systemic racism within our organization, which is really tough. There were tough conversations, working with various consultants to help train our staff. We started the People's Fund, which is funding Black activists in the United States for anything they want to do to build up resources and access to our funders, access to our platform. I mean, there's just we haven't even done enough. We're nowhere near where we need to be. And I'm constantly searching for where does the systemic racism exist? Where does the systemic misogyny exist within the organization? And just, you have to be very, as somebody said, humble. We have to be so humble going at this and realize that, we're this air you breathe. So you're constantly having to look at it, and it's hard work. We've lost some donors over it, for sure. We lost some supporters over it who didn't like the social media we were posting about why we're an anti-racist organization. They were like, what the heck does this have to do with animals? And they left, and there was a lot of angry posts about that. But it's the right thing to do. I agree entirely that what we don't want to be doing is in our solutions be contributing to oppression. So you have to look at it through that lens.
Thanks. Leah, just a quick follow-up, because it's so interesting to hear. So you said you lost supporters, you lost donors. That's, I think, what a lot of people would expect to hear. But is Mercy for Animals continuing to grow? Is it stagnating?
Oh, no, we're growing.
Yeah, so you lost some donors, but...
We did. I think this is what happens. So I could go on about this, but...
Yeah, you could say another 10 seconds.
I'll say very briefly, when you're... at some risk here, I'll say it, but when you're an organization that built a lot of its program or a lot of its history on perhaps prosecuting slaughterhouse workers, brown and black slaughterhouse workers, you've got a supporter base that some of them came because they were like, yeah, this resonates with me. And then you lose those people as you grow, but then you gain a much bigger platform from widening the circle of compassion and widening the supporters and widening and staying with the movement. And ultimately I think it actually will address the overall systemic oppression, which is causing factory farming, which is causing exploitation of animals in the meantime.
It's really interesting. Thanks. Kathy?
Yeah, I would say some of the very important lessons to take from the Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movements is the importance of public outrage and the importance of videotaping horrible conduct and using that to educate the public. I think we all know that things might have come out a little differently in some of these cases if there hadn't been some videotape that could be shown to the to the public about the way certain people were being treated by the police, and the importance of social media to get the word out about unlawful, horrendous, atrocious conduct, and all of that can obviously benefit what we do. I think, by the way, I just want to say, I'm all for animal rights. Hello, of course. I'm just saying that while Steve is working on that, which is great, there's a lot of other work that needs to be done to prevent suffering of animals, and there are people working on that. All of it should be done together, parallel tracks, and it's all very important. And before I leave that point, I will say, in terms of the public outrage and public education and media attention to these problems that we saw be very successful in the Black Lives Matter and Me Too movements, I mean, the media that the Non-Human Rights Project has generated, that Steve has generated, has been phenomenal and really, really important to our movement. So we're very happy about that. And obviously, using the media in an effective way to educate the public, the mainstream, whatever you want to call it, about the atrocious conduct that goes on with respect to animals in many different spheres is hugely important. So if anything, we should be finding ways to get the media to cover more of our issues the way they're covering the non-human rights story, which is a really wonderful narrative, and it's just been tremendous.
Great, thank you.
Okay, I just want to say we're at a point in human history where we are reinventing the food system. And it's really important. I differ from many of my colleagues in the industry. We have to think not only about the technology, but how this technology is going to impact food justice, distribution, and the ability for people in underserved communities, small stakeholder farmers, et cetera, to participate in this food system, to decentralize it. So there are certain technologies that are going to support decentralization and more access to food and participation in the food system, and there are technologies that are going to continue corporate consolidation. So this is something we have to think about, and we can't just say, just because it's going to save animals, it's good. We have to think about how do we create a fair, equal, just food system for all.
Great. Thanks. And just, Lauren and then Gary, we're going to go to you. I want to just remind everyone, if we can, the shorter we speak on these answers, which is impossible because there's a lot of us, the more of the questions we'll get to hear. But Lauren and then Gary.
I like that you say that just at this
No,
question.
no.
It's entirely what my organization is based on. Food Empowerment Project, we have been led by these values. This is basically the work that we do. We work on lack of access to healthy foods in Black and Brown communities. We're made up of predominantly women of color. So our organization has been this from the very beginning. We are celebrating our 15-year anniversary, and we want to talk about financial support. You will notice that we are much smaller than organizations that are much younger than us because of the fact that we have been talking about these issues. One of the most beautiful things that's happened to us over time is how many people will come up to me and talk about how amazing it is to hear someone who looks like them talk about the animals and talk about veganism. And that's something that doesn't get talked about enough in our movement, is the representation. So I think that in some ways representation has changed, but in some ways it's cosmetic diversity. I really want to applaud the young people who I think try to, and still we have a lot to go in the Me Too movement, in the animal rights movement, and a lot of that was done by young women. So I just really, a lot of that's been happening is because of the young people, and so I thank you and I applaud you for that. And I thank you for getting an organization like Food Empowerment Project that has always stood and advocated for Black and Brown people as well as non-human animals.
Thank you, Lauren. Gary?
Yeah, I mean, I've always thought it was a no-brainer rather, to say, I mean, if you're in favor of animal rights because speciesism is a really bad idea, speciesism is bad because it's like racism, sexism, and other irrelevant criteria for excluding beings from the moral community, that we have to be opposed to these other things as well. I've been very troubled over the years to see, you have these animal welfare organizations that target things like, the killing of dogs in China. I mean, they're not willing to take a position that killing any chickens is a problem because it's a welfare organization. And, yes, maybe one day we'll be vegan, but now we have to be, worry about humane treatment. And I think that it's really important that, look at the fur campaign. The fur campaign has been the most relentlessly misogynistic campaign in the history of campaigns. So, I think that's a really, we need to be a little more careful about those sorts of campaigns in our own movement. There are a lot of these single issue campaigns trade on racism, xenophobia, and misogyny, and they have no place, as far as I'm concerned, they have no place in the movement.
Justin, can I just say one short thing? The word Russia has not been said in Ukraine, and this is something that's looming large in my life now because, and the point that what makes it relevant here is, among these injustices, things can come up and demand constant attention from NGOs and from advocacy organizations. So I'm now involved in, because I have a medical school appointment as well, I'm now involved in a series of discussions which would not have existed a week ago, and it's about whether some NGOs that deliver health care unrelated to the Russian government in rural parts of Russia should shut down now. And this is a really, really serious question, and it's an argument that parallels a lot of the sort of things that we talk about. By continuing to deliver the health care, are you in effect tacitly supporting the regime? If you don't deliver the health care, lots of people who are already suffering will suffer. And it's an amazing example of how an event, a completely exogenous shock outside of anyone's horizon, can now suddenly affect the functioning of a whole set of NGO organizations. And that's one of the things that I think should always be borne in mind, how much advocacy organizations are sort of hostage, to all kinds of forces and events beyond their control.
For sure. Thanks. All right, maybe we'll take the next two questions in a row, Ilan and Lori.
I'll try to go fast. Ilan April. So I had another term that I don't think came up at all, that I was just curious what people thought about how this impacts all the calculus around strategy, which is climate change. So in addition to the moral imperative of ending animal suffering, we have this sort of existential imperative in the next 10 years, which may not wipe out the human species, but could impact a lot of other species. And so, especially in terms of Lori's helpful distinction between reforms and non-reformist reforms, how that might, should it be impacting strategy, and if so, how?
Yeah.
Thank you. And then, Lori, do you want to put your question into it? We'll sort of.
Very brief. Going back to the very beginning of this, where the question was asked about mainstreaming and is mainstreaming good. And I think Lori, you suggested that mainstreaming may not be good because it may represent the status quo, and I totally get that, but I think there's a different way to construe mainstreaming, not as necessarily compromise and regression to the mean, but as taking over the power structure. And so I would just suggest that that would be perhaps a fruitful way to think about whether or not we want to go mainstream.
Great. Lori, do you want to start first since that one's specific, and then if people want to think about either that question or the climate change, go for it.
I do think part of what is going on is that everybody has a very specific and different attitude, which is what we were saying. We're living in, we're very, if we have anything in common as human animals, it might be that we're the only ones that destroy our home, which is connected to the climate problem. That might be the thing we have in common. But what I think we should be focusing on is how much we don't have in common. And I was just highlighting, both through the idea of reform and non-reform, but also mainstreaming, that there's some ways in which you could get co-opted by a system that's designed to do precisely what it does do, which is use animals and destroy the environment. There's ways, not every single part of our system, but there are ways in which part of all sorts of structures that we live under are designed to do precisely what they're doing. And so we need to worry when we're incorporating our activist work into that part of the system.
Great, thanks. Yeah, others want to jump in on either question?
The CAFO system of raising animals, I think we all agree, is a horrific destructive system which harms the animals, harms the environment, harms food safety, harms the black and brown people who are forced to live near these places, and is a significant factor in climate change. And so when we look at the CAFO system that way, it brings it all together. That interconnectedness becomes really obvious. So when we work on climate change, one of the things I'd like to see happen, and it's been very frustrating, is how little climate change activists, how little they've talked about the CAFO system. They talk about, fossil fuels and all of that, but we need to get them talking about the CAFO system and how destructive it is and how it needs to end.
Sure, absolutely. Kathy?
Well, climate change is the moral imperative. If we don't do something about climate change, everything else we're doing is for naught here. So I think it should be, obviously, foremost in everything we do, trying to figure out ways to address it, change our lifestyles to do our own individual parts. So many animals are already suffering because of climate change. They're dying, they're becoming extinct, they're being displaced, and it's only going to get worse and worse. So yeah, climate change is probably the most important thing that any of us could be working on right now. And by the way, our clinic is working on CAFO and climate change, so I can't divulge exactly what we're doing.
Leah, you had a look in your eyes like you might want to talk. I know you want to talk, Dale. Would you like to say something, Leah? You're not.
I feel these people have been waiting so
Yeah.
long, and I would love to hear the other.
We're definitely going to get to them. But we have
Well,
5 more
we're-
minutes. So
Ooh, got
if you
5
wanna-
minutes,
we're
so.
talking-
5 minutes left.
So I think there's one thing that should be said about climate change as someone who's worked on these areas for decades. We're at a time when there's this huge intersection between climate protection and animal protection. And in that sense, it's very productive and wonderful. But I have to say, as someone who lives in both of these communities, there is the risk of the animal protection community overplaying this and cherry-picking data. And so one of the things that I've been most concerned about in the center I direct is actually really doing rigorous research and making sure that it isn't just a matter of, oh, I read this in the New York Times and now I'm putting it in my organization's thing and so on and so forth, because isn't this happy? You should be saving animals because you care about climate. So it's important to be really rigorous in the use of data and to show sincerity with respect to both causes if you claim to be involved in both causes.
That's a great point.
Great.
Manisha and Doug, do you want to put your questions out?
Thanks, Justin.
Thank you.
Yes, Manisha Decker from the University of Victoria, Faculty of Law. Thank you, first of all, to all the panelists. So for reasons that people have mentioned with respect to systemic issues, human psychology, let's say, my own personal view is that the movement here, in one national jurisdiction, but also more broadly across the globe, really needs to kind of focus our attention on children. And I'd just like to hear kind of general responses to that. Are we doing it enough if it's so dismal, the prospects of changing sedimented views about what we eat among adults? Why is it that we're not focusing on children? And related to that, I also want to, highlight the suggestion and arguments that others have made that the movement is really like a women's movement. And what we really need to be doing with children is understanding like the extent which gender training, gender normalization, just this idea of toxic masculinity is so powerful in teaching kids, and especially, little boys, that violence is okay, that empathy is wrong, that sublimation of emotions is what's required to be a, masculine type of scientist, or eating animals or not eating plants is what's required to be a certain type of man, and have support and go forward in your life. So do we need more attention, the question is, on children, and especially kind of the really heteronormative gender messages that kids get in many societies?
Thank you. Doug, please.
Hi, Doug Kaiser. Gary mentioned the idea of a racism-free Monday or a sexism-free Monday, and I think he meant it as a reductio ad absurdum. But I actually started thinking about it, and I think I quite like the idea. And it's because of the distinction between formal equality in law and substantive equality in one's lived experience, and the yawning gap that exists between those two things, sadly, in our society. And I started imagining a Monday, one day a week, where Black moms didn't have to worry about their sons getting shot by white cops, where brown parents knew they could send their kids across town to a white, segregated, beautiful, brand new public school where trans kids didn't have to view going to the bathroom as a stressful and potentially violent distraction from their learning environment, where women didn't have to worry about sexual assault every time they went to a parking lot. I tried to imagine one day a week where we could have substantive rights, not just formal rights, and I thought it was quite beautiful, but also important, radical. Radical. And I don't know how to actually enact those kinds of laws and enforce them, but when it comes to a Meatless Monday, I'm pretty sure I could draft that ordinance and I could enforce it. And so for one day a week, people in a society would know that they could be vegan in their schools, in their cafeterias, in their restaurants, in their businesses, and the sky wouldn't fall, and in fact, they might find that they actually enjoy it. So I guess the question is, can the welfarist incremental advocacy approach be seen not only as pragmatic, but also as kind of subversively radical?
Absolutely.
Thank you both. Thanks, Doug.
Yeah.
So we want to start. I see Lauren, your hand. Do you want to start? Sometimes we forget the people online.
Well, I just want to say that I think that, oops, I'm trying to
You're fine. Don't worry about it.
sometimes I think that, again, me trying to be delicate, that there's like the people there's this group on one side that welfare is the only thing, and then you have people on the other side who are saying it's only this one way to do it as well. And I think so many of us fall a bit in the middle, in the sense that, like for myself, my organization will only promote animal rights and veganism, but it doesn't mean that I don't understand why other people do the work that they do. However, I agree with Gary that some of it has been damaging. If I think back on an organization that had a campaign against a grocery store for how they raised and killed animals for food, and then I went to speak at a school, and they're like, oh no, this group says that all the animals are treated well, I can eat animals from there now. So I think that, just taking this like the Meatless Monday, like I get why that could be seen as radical, especially when you look at it in terms of the beautiful ways in which you envisioned a world could be for Black and brown people. But I think that we as a movement sometimes forget that Sue Coe actually said this to me before, that animal rights activists are arrogant enough to believe that we have the right to speak for another species. And when we look at human rights issues, we allow those people who are advocating with to speak for themselves. And we can't do that with non-human animals. And I think that we need to have some humility in which we talk about these things, because I know that my animals who I've had in my life certainly have more kindness than sometimes I've felt. And I just sometimes think that maybe that's what more we need to bring to the table, is understanding that as long as groups aren't confusing their mission, it's a lot easier to talk about these things. So if that animal rights group hadn't been an animal rights group that was saying the animals are treated better, it would have been easier for me to say, well, that's an organization that works on how animals are raised and killed for food, but I'm here to talk to you today about not consuming animals. So maybe I just rambled unnecessarily, but that's just my quick breakdown.
Thank you. Anybody have a reaction to either of the questions?
I just want to talk about Meatless Monday for a second, not riffing off of Lauren, but the question, and that is a way to set an example. At Miyoko's, we have Meatless Monday every day because we have a rule, you can't bring any animal products into the company, and so we provide free meals all day long to everyone, free organic vegan meals. So we have 200 employees, and they all eat vegan meals, and they're vegan 5 days a week, and as a result, even though we don't require people be vegan to be hired, a large percentage of our employees, even those that used to work at a slaughterhouse down the street, are now vegan. And it's really just showing them that it's possible.
I just wanted to sort of reiterate something that Manisha Dekker said, that this, and this goes, I think, back to what Doug was saying too. I think that it is actually really important to help people to see, however you help people to see. Maybe it's for kids, but maybe it's also, I think people don't realize how difficult it is for trans children, how difficult it is for kids of color in communities where their parents are being sent to prison. That these are really important issues about education and about values, right? So I think focusing, it's not, I don't think we can generalize. I think focusing on doing something to help shift the perspective of kids and grown kids will really actually do a lot to change things. I do think, though, that back to what Lauren was saying about consistency, we have to be very, very clear about what it is that we're doing. And if it's just meant to be, we're going to just be vegan on Monday, that's not going to do it. Or we're just going to be non-misogynist on Wednesday. That's not quite going to do it. It's meant to be enlightening.
That's great. Anybody else? I know that we're over time, and I mean, I don't want to hold people. I mean, David, if you want to put your question out, and Leslie, we can. I think it would be more like reluctant to give anyone in the audience the last word, but I think we're all interested in hearing what people say. We're 5 minutes over, so.
Well, I'll understand if people escape early. David Rosengard, I'm with the Animal Legal Defense Fund, Lewis and Clark Law School, and so I want to really build off of the comments that Lori made about sort of the importance of honest, clear terms debate. And I want to unite that with what I hope I'm accurate in saying is I think a default baseline that everyone in this room is operating from, which is we all want more justice and more just systems. And in particular, those of us who are attorneys have a professional obligation to build more just systems. So I'm hoping we can use that to dig into and get a little more clarity on, in particular, the criminal justice system. Since I gather that many of the panelists, like myself, and I think many people in this room, feel that this system is not one that has reached justice. We are aspirationally reaching, but we're not there. So what I'm curious is, for people who have concerns about use of the criminal justice system, is that concern the framing of unlawful animal cruelty as a societal criminal issue versus a private civil issue? Is the concern what cases and what defendants that law is applied to? Is the concern what outcomes may be uncritically applied as a result of pleas or verdicts in those cases? Is the concern that that law historically has difficulty being applied to people up the systemic chain? Is the concern something else entirely? Because I think that it's important for us to be clear so we can figure out how to address the concerns.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Leslie, do you want to put yours? I think we are, as over time. I just want to hear everyone and acknowledge, and lots to think about there, David. I mean, I don't think we'll. Go ahead, Leslie.
So I'll be super quick. So I'm Leslie Bisgold. I'm a lawyer from Toronto. I've worked in animal rights and human rights, and I, for that reason, have really enjoyed what I'm hearing developing here today. Kathy, I rudely shouted out when you were talking about the victories about achieving certain humane standards. It was me who rudely said, what about prolonging? And I'm sorry, I'm usually much better at holding that in, and I do apologize because that was a rude way to respond. But I do have a real concern about conflicting messages that we're giving, because of course everybody in this room has the same goal. No doubt everybody's intentions are pure. But we need to think about our messaging, and we need to be consistent, and I don't think that's impossible to do. We all feel overwhelmed. This is too much. How are we possibly going to make a dent in it? But if we're operating, as Dale says, like, we don't know what is going to finally cause it, right? So the best we can do is just put out there what we really mean. So if we are telling the public at once that we think animals are not the sort of creatures that should be owned and exploited by other animals, but look, we're doing it humanely, I think we're giving them a very conflicting message. And of course, we all need to know that we are reducing the suffering. We are human. We are animals too. We are also subject to the weaknesses of everybody out there, our own egos. We need to feel as though we are accomplishing something. We need to feel as though we are helping. But we need to rise above our own egos and ask ourselves, are we giving a consistent message? Maybe that's the best we can do, is to not tell people at once we shouldn't be exploiting animals, but we can exploit animals humanely. We know we're not really saying that, but that's not what the public is hearing. So as a last word, what I try to do in this impossible job in making a distinction between what is an action worth taking and what is one that we might leave for later or not, is ask myself, is this action disputing the property status of animals? Maybe I'm not going to be destroying it, But is this an action that is perpetuating the property status, or is it showing that in some way the property status of animals, the assumption that we can own and do what we want, is in dispute? It doesn't always work, but it does help in some cases. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Leslie. Well, I think, I mean, there's a lot to talk about that sort of, we will carry on some of these conversations, both Leslie's and David's. Tomorrow morning, we do have time for conversation set aside, and I hope others of you will ask questions. I don't think the panel will necessarily be up here, but they are going to be here and responsive. But I'm not going to make anyone sit here any longer, so please thank the panel with me. I thought it was really fun to hear you all. I appreciate your time. And have a great afternoon.